Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Bridge for Early Career Preachers conversation on preaching for the planet. We are so glad that you've joined us tonight. Welcome. If you're new to us, the mission of the Bridge for Early Career Preachers is to provide resources, continuing education, and a supportive community for those who are moving from aspiring to active preaching ministries. So, for those of you who are in your first several years, as you make your way in preaching, we are here to continue learning with you, to walk with you as you make your way in the work of preaching. For those of you who may have gathered with us and you're a little further along in your career, welcome. We're glad you're here too. I'm confident you'll find something in tonight's conversation that will feed you. My name is Rich Voles. I serve as Associate Professor of Preaching and Worship at Union Presbyterian Seminary based out of our Richmond, Virginia campus. I also serve as the Director of the Bridge for Early Career Preachers. As I noted, our conversation topic for the night is preaching for the planet, and I will serve as our host and moderator. For those of you who are watching in, if you have comments or questions at any time, please feel free to submit those in the chat. I'll keep an eye on those in real time, and we will also try to reserve some time for us to address any comments or questions you have at the end of our time together. So do think about what you might like to ask our panelists and as our conversation gets started. So tonight we're joined by two guests that I'm really excited to spend time with. They're here to share their knowledge, their expertise, their wisdom about our topic. Each of them have extensive bios, and I'm going to do my best to do them justice while also trying to keep them brief. Our first guest is the Reverend Dr. Leah D. Shade, who serves as Associate Professor of Preaching and Worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. She's an ordained Lutheran minister in the ELCA for more than 20 years, and earned both her MDiv and PhD degrees from the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, which is now United Lutheran Seminary. She's pastored 3 Pennsylvania congregations in suburban, urban, and rural contexts. And she's the author or editor or co-author of several books, including, and I'll include the ones that are relevant for our topic for tonight, Creation Crisis Preaching, Ecology, Theology, and the Pulpit, as well as For the Beauty of the Earth, a devotional, also with Chalice Press. She's co-editor and author with Margaret Bullitt Jonas of Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. And she is also the eco-preacher blogger for the website Patheos. Welcome, Leah. Glad you're here. And we're also really excited to welcome the Reverend Dr. Xavier L. Johnson, who serves as Assistant Professor in the Practice of Preaching and Black Church Studies at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. Professor Johnson also serves as Senior Pastor of Bethel Baptist Church in Dayton, Ohio. He earned his Doctor of Ministry in Ministry Development from Virginia Theological Seminary and holds both a Master of Arts in Theological Studies and a Master of Arts in Teaching. Dr. Johnson chairs the Social Justice Commission for the Ohio Baptist General Convention and works closely with the Ohio Council of Churches Death Penalty Abolition Committee. He's also a member of the Commission on Human Rights, Peace Building, and Reconciliation for the Baptist World Alliance. He's published book chapters and written articles and papers for several publications and organizations, including the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, the World Council of Churches, the Baptist World Alliance, and the Lot Carey Foreign Missions Society. So now that we have thoroughly read your CVs, welcome to you both. Really glad that you're here for the conversation tonight.
Thanks for having us, Rich.
Yeah, man, it's really great to be here.
All right, so let's dive in, y'all. I like to often start with definitions in these conversations. So right off the bat, let's start with just a really kind of basic question. What is your description, your definition of climate crisis? Or if you prefer a different term, let us know what that term is and then unpack it for us. Xavier, can we start with you?
Sure. Definitions of climate crisis. You know, my definition of climate crisis is really connected to social justice work. And so when I think of the climate crisis, I think of not just the climate crisis, but I think of the climate crisis in terms of ecological justice issues and environmental exploitation. And so I look at it through that lens. And so I think the climate crisis is, to paraphrase James Cone, is environmental exploitation that is the byproduct of white supremacy and racism in the world, if that makes sense.
Indeed, it does. So can I get you to repeat that one more time? Because I'm taking notes. I'm trying to be a good note taker. Environmental exploitation. And, yeah.
That is the byproduct of white supremacy in the world. Professor Cohn, along with many others, like Dolores Williams, really did a good job of connecting the issues of environmental exploitation and white supremacy, and showing that the logic that informs white supremacist exploitation of people or people of color around the world, right, is the same logic that leads to environmental exploitation.
Yeah, I appreciate the ways that those are linked together, such that white supremacy is not just sort of a thought process that may have certain outcomes that we might typically or stereotypically associate with white supremacy, but it's very much linked with the exploitation of the environment.
It affects people and planet.
People and planet. Yeah. Thank you. Leah?
Yes, I want to build on what Xavier just said. So if white supremacy and the white capitalist system of exploitation is the illness, I think we can say that our planet is being overcome with a kind of sepsis of this infection of white supremacy, patriarchy, hierarchy. And the way that's manifesting itself is in the same way that the body is overcome with an infection. So when you're a little sick, your temperature's like 99 degrees and you're not feeling so good, but you can function. When you're getting into like the 100, 101 degrees, you're really sick, you're in bed, you're not doing anything. It goes up a couple more degrees, you are in danger of your organs shutting down and your body not being able to come back from that tipping point. We are coming close to that really dangerous temperature with our planet, and it's having symptoms that seem to be contradictory. Like, when you're really sick, you're feverish, but you're also really cold at the same time. And things just aren't working right. You're really thirsty, but you're just like, you're sweating, like nothing is working right. And the same thing has happened with our planetary bodily systems, where some places are getting too much rain, some not enough, some are too cold, some are too hot. The balance, the equilibrium is in jeopardy. So this is the result of this sickness of exploitation that is fueled by this infection of white supremacy and capitalism.
I love that we have both of you on here because David, you're talking more about the cause, giving us a diagnosis, if we can kind of extend that metaphor. And Leah, you're talking about the effects, right? And I love this metaphor of thinking about it in terms of sepsis. I mean, because that presents such a danger, and it's a drastic term for anybody who knows someone who has had sepsis before. The remedy for that is pretty intense. So I love that we get both here a sense of the cause and the effect. You care to riff any more on that, either of you?
I appreciate. So first of all, I'm a Leah Shade fan. She's a dear friend, but I'm also a fan, and so I appreciate her expansion of the conversation to include not just white supremacy, but capitalism and this example of sepsis, because one of the things that we see happening as the Earth struggles to try to reestablish equilibrium is things happen paradoxically. Things happen that don't make sense. Yeah. Like, for example, all of a sudden it's warm in Antarctica, but those places where it's supposed to rain, it's dry. places where it's usually dry, it's raining. All of these things are signs and symptoms that point us to the larger issues of white supremacy and capitalism, and their
Mm,
effects on both the planet and the people. And so
mm.
I really think that's a great metaphor to use to really have this conversation. You're cold and you're hot all at the same time. You have a fever, yet you have the chills.
Yeah. And one more way to think about this, especially looking at the capitalism aspect of this, the premise of capitalism is unfettered growth at all costs. It doesn't matter who we exploit, who's suffering, it's about growth. Well, what is unfettered growth in the body? It's cancer.
Mhm.
So we are experiencing the effects of unfettered growth that are causing cancerous tumors throughout the body of the planet, communities, and in our own bodies.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the illnesses that are happening because of chemicals, plastics, pollutions in the water, in the air, in the ground are having a massive effect on our personal health, our public health. It's a public health issue, and on our communities. So this unchecked growth for the sake of growth is incredibly unhealthy, and I think that's one of the ways that in our preaching we can help people understand what's going on using these kinds of metaphors, because people understand what those mean. Climate change is so huge; it's planetary. It's really hard to wrap your mind around it. So I think using these comparisons can be helpful.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, Leah. Yeah. I mean, I should have known inviting a couple of preachers on here that we'd start talking about metaphors. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, beginning to frame the issue through metaphors helps make more sense for us. So I appreciate that even just at the defining spot for us, which can be something that's so hard, whether we're just talking about it in everyday life or we're trying to talk about it in a sermon, like you all have started with really concrete language, metaphors that can do a lot of work for us. So thank you for that. So my next question is, we've talked a little bit about sort of basic definitions, but what animates your theological thinking about the web of creation and the ecological crisis? And then, as a sort of second question that follows up on that, what animates your homiletical thought and practice? And maybe you can talk about how those two are linked together. Leah, can I start with you?
Sure. When I started doing this work in connecting and creating an eco theology, I really built it around an ecofeminist theology, thinking about the work and a womanist eco theology, thinking about the ways in which our metaphors um, are not helpful when we language the divine and when we language the earth. And when we talk about um, virgin timber or barren soil, um, hold on, what happened with my screen?
All right. I think we
Can you
might.
hear me?
We can hear you. Yep.
Okay. For some reason, my screen went completely blank,
All right.
but I'm still, you all can still hear me?
We can hear you clear. So just go right
Okay.
ahead.
All right. So, and then so the language that we use is detrimental both to females, to women, to girls, and to the planet, because we animalize women. We call them uh, certain animal names like a bitch or a fox or a cow, and we feminize earth in really harmful ways. And so my project was about how do we understand the connections between um, women and the environment, and and how does our theology speak to that? So I'm very interested in a liberation theology that looks at the real experiences of how climate change and environmental issues affect those most vulnerable, including women, children, women of color, communities of color, island nations, those who are on the front lines that are being affected by this. And how can our theology help to deconstruct this hierarchical, patriarchal notion that um, women and earth are on the bottom of this pyramid, and white males are at the top nearest to God? I find that to be incredibly harmful. It's been going on for thousands of years, and I think that's a big contributor to where we are in this situation. So if we're going to talk about climate change and environmental issues, we have to think about our language, our spirituality, and our false notions about the separations between humanity and the rest of the animals and the rest of the planet. So I think in both meta big terms, but also the real experiences of people who are living with the effects of this.
That's really helpful for you to walk us through that. I imagine there will be some similarities with you, Xavier. So how do you frame this? What animates your theological thinking about the web of creation and ecological crisis?
So, Rich, I often tell people I'm a practicing practical theologian. And that means I not only teach in a seminary, but I pastor a local church and I deal with the day-to-day issues that pastors deal with every day. And so as a part of that, particularly as a pastor in a Midwestern city in the Rust Belt, I see every day the real effects of ecological exploitation, environmental exploitation on the people that I pastor and the community I pastor. I'm also a Floridian. And so I have watched hurricanes and thunderstorms, our tropical storms, get stronger and stronger every year. I have watched the seashore, the shoreline erode in parts of my home state. I am in a city where sometimes you can smell the waste coming from the landfill. When I wrote my DMin dissertation, I did this interesting section on the city of Dayton and discovered that socioeconomics and education aside, there were certain illnesses and diseases that Black people faced. And I pastor a predominantly Black congregation, and they face those issues because, watch this, connection between white supremacy, environmental exploitation. They face those because of redlining. So Black people have literally been living in the same communities by and large in this area since before and after the Federal Housing Act, right? And because of that, and because of where they chose to build those factories and where the waste was disposed, no matter what your socioeconomic status was or education level was, you got exposed to the same issues, to the same environmental factors. And so now you have the same health issues. I pastor those people.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff that animates my thinking about the web of creation and the ecological crisis, because I see it every day. And now I have to preach to people who have cancer because of where they live, who have all kinds of issues because they lived in public housing that may have had lead paint, right? Or who now have children and their own respiratory issues because they had to breathe this air, right? Are they sitting here? They're smelling. They're breathing the air that's wafting off over the Black side of the city from the landfill. And so, how do we preach to that? How do we help our people to understand that this is more than just a health issue? It's more than just an ecological issue. It is a theological issue. It's a social justice issue that we as Christians have a mandate to name and to address. How do we help our other sisters and brothers in our community to understand that you have benefited from the fact that these things were not put in your communities, they were put in ours, and now we're suffering the consequences of that. You know, how do you speak to that? How does your preaching help people to see that? That's the kind of stuff I think about when I preach about these issues.
Can I add on to that? Because I love what you're saying, Xavier, and it also happens in rural communities.
Yes.
So when I was pastoring in central Pennsylvania, I was active in the fractivist movement, or the anti-fracking movement. Fracking is a process where you drill down into the earth 1 or 2 miles to explode the earth underneath to release gas, and then use that for all kinds of nefarious purposes. So there was a really interesting theology being used to rationalize this practice that causes cancer, low birth weight in babies, intersexed fish in the rivers, massive die-offs of fish, animals being killed. Okay, so all of these bad things are happening. But when I would see letters to the editor or comments on Facebook that God gave the earth to human beings to do with as they please, because we were given this earth, Genesis 1:28, to conquer it and to be fruitful and multiply, ignoring the Genesis 2:15 teaching that God puts us into the earth to till and to keep.
Yeah.
So it's not, dominion is often interpreted as domination, and not in the sense of you are responsible for ensuring the flourishing of what God has called good. It's not your hotel room to trash and think that, the maids are going to come and clean it up for you, or that Big Daddy in the sky is going to come and pluck you out of it and, literally to hell with the earth. That's really a harmful theology, but I hear it a lot in some circles, and that's theological malpractice, to use Dr. William Barber's words.
Name it. Yeah.
To piggyback on what Leah just said, I think she gives us some really good language there, because again, that same logic that says we have a right as human beings to exploit the earth, that same hermeneutic says we also have a right to exploit women, as their property, and that people of color are less than, right?
Yes.
And so we have to name that as a problem. The other thing that to add on to that, one of the other things that I use to animate my thinking is a return back to many of our Native, Indigenous American spiritualities and Africana theology and spirituality. There's this myth that particularly, Black folks don't care about the environment and yada, 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 blase, blase. That's untrue. Our religious practices are steeped in a deep respect for the environment, right? I'm thinking of the work of Diane Glave and Melanie Harris and Jawanza Eric Clark that really unpacks how people of color and indigenous folk have helped to but particularly Black people have really had a long history of being environmentally focused. And these are things that we can pull on to help form a corrective, to help be a corrective to some of this white supremacist, capitalistic, Euro-American Christian theology. There are things and so we have to use those tools as a corrective and read deeply and imbibe deeply from these sources to help us correct some of this stuff. Because if not, this
is fantastic. I mean, y'all are giving out so much good stuff. I'm trying to find my way toward a summary comment to tie some of these pieces together. But I think for those folks who are watching and listening in, what's your starting point? Kind of is at the base of this question. What's your kind of theological starting point? And you all have given us a number of options, right? So Xavier, when you first started talking, you were talking about sort of a sense of pastoral solidarity, right? A sense of like, these are my people and I see what's happening. I'm able to just sort of critically read the situation, and my sense of solidarity with them is a theological starting point. And to talk about, Leah, this sense of uh, more thoroughly exegeting the scriptures, right? In addition to the sort of starting point of eco-womanism, or excuse me, ecofeminism and eco-womanism, that gives you a grounding liberation starting point. But that sort of scriptural response and scriptural counter witness, if we want to call it that as well, right, to harmful theological malpractice, as you noted. And then Xavier, again, to come back to sort of the what's already lurking there for me in terms of African and African American and indigenous spiritualities and approaches to the earth that are already part of the resources of me and my community. I think all of these, just one is great, but when you start linking them together, we start to develop a really robust theological approach that I y'all are helping me. So thank you. So you've already started to name some of this in some ways, but as it relates to ecological crisis, what intersectional identities or issues come into play, particularly as you start to think about preaching? Xavier, would you get us started on this one?
Ooh, thank you. As it relates to ecological crisis, what intersectional identities or issues come into play, particularly as it relates to preaching? I think we've already named them, a few of them, right? The intersection of being that womanist intersection, right? That great tripartite lens that womanists use, that trifocal lens of gender, race, and class. I think that's a great place to start, particularly for some of us brothers, particularly, as we engage in this, sometimes we forget and we use a lot of the language that Leah named for us earlier as we have conversation about the earth, not realizing what that language represents in our preaching. And so sometimes we perpetuate the very thing we're trying to preach against by using that language. And so we have to be very careful. And one of the ways that we can do that is by reading womanist and feminist theologians who are talking about this work. I love the work of Melanie Harris. I read it again over the summer, but what does it mean to read some indigenous folks and see how they're talking about an indigenous theologian? What does it mean to go and read some Asian theologians, right? How do we expand our thinking? We do that by reading things from other traditions, even reading outside of our own faith tradition, to see how we might gain some wisdom from there. So I think that we start there by understanding that oftentimes it's not just one group. And I must name this. I appreciate the question about intersectional identities, because sometimes in the conversation about environmental exploitation and ecological justice, we act as if and we talk as if the climate crisis is everybody's fault. And we have to be honest and name where the culprits lie, right? Now, granted, there may be African and Asian and other folks of color around the world who are suffering the brunt of the consequences at this point, but it's not necessarily their fault. We can't blame the brother in Africa who's herding cattle for the climate change. His little farm is not what did this, and it's not helpful to talk about these issues as if we're all equally culpable.
Yeah.
And so therefore, we all equally have to come to the table to fix it. Yes, we all need to help fix it, but we also have to name how we got here and who was at the point of it. Right? As we think about the Caribbean and all that's happening in the islands, those hurricanes that are intensifying and coming through the Caribbean, it's not the folks in Trinidad and Haiti's fault that, and we have to name that. And I think that's a part of those intersectional identities and issues that come into play as we preach about this. We have to name these things in the preaching moment, even as we encourage us to come together to work on a solution. We also have to tell the truth in the preaching moment about how we got here and why we are here. Capitalism and white supremacy. It starts there. If we don't start there, we stand the chance of obfuscating the issue and trying to apply blame equally everywhere when that's not the case. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And I'm thinking to extend it even further. As I hear you talk about the Caribbean islands, then we're talking about colonialism as well.
Yes.
Right. Which
absolutely.
is that history of exploitation. Like, what can we extract? What can we take? Which there's a direct through line to our contemporary capitalistic systems, which try to extract and exploit. But yeah, you're making perfect sense to me. So that's very helpful. Leah?
I want to think about a different kind of intersectionality, and that is with our earth kin. And I want to actually relate this to a question that Janice Locke asked in the chat. She asked, in the current social political context, how do we keep from becoming fatalistic, that nothing we can say or do will be heard or accepted? So my answer is actually, it's speaking to your question, Rich, but it's also speaking to Janice's. In the work that I'm doing with a partnership between Lexington Theological Seminary, the BTS Center, and Creation Justice Ministries, we're doing a grant called Compelling Preaching for a Climate Changed World. And Xavier is one of our Eco Preacher Cohort kinship group facilitators. Very glad to have him with us. And we did a pilot program 2 years ago, and we not only did questionnaires with our preachers, but also with their congregants, to find out what it is that really resonates for people. And what we found is that people actually have a yearning and a hunger and a longing to connect with God's creation at the local level, with their local ecosystems, biosystems. When people understand the spiritual connection that's there, and that this is not some kind of tree worshiping, but it's really honoring the creator of the trees, and they see that caring for creation is part of their Christian vocation, and they see that this web of life is so connected that when we think about the least of these that Jesus talks about, and we go all the way through down to the very basics of life that enable our lives to flourish, then we can see that the things that we do that are for the health of the microbes and the earthworms and the insects and the pollinators and the krill in the sea, like the smallest units of life, when they're healthy, we are all healthy. So the intersection goes all the way through our human systems, but it also connects us with our earth kin. And once we understand that at a really deep and spiritual level, I think that starts to shift things for people, because it's no longer like, I can't do anything. Now I want to, because I love this planet. I love the life around me. I love the animals, the trees. Everybody has some place in nature that they love. And when we connect on a point of love, that can shift things.
Xavier, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you, Janice. I did not see your question to build on what Leah just said. That's one of the reasons I personally love Africana and indigenous spirituality and theologies, because they often prescribe what could be viewed as remedies for helping to restore the earth and helping to bring back balance, right? In ways that oftentimes some of our Euro-American tradition, Christian tradition, does not.
Right.
And so I would recommend maybe looking there and thinking of how we might create liturgies around restoration
Mm.
of the earth, right? So that we're not so fatalistic, right? So that we're not coming in talking about the sky is falling literally. That yes, we name that truth, and after we name that truth, okay, so how do we go about remedying this? Many other religious traditions and spiritualities have remedies for restoring balance and equilibrium to nature, that I think would help us, if we read deeply and, like I said, imbibe deeply from those wells and utilize some of that in our preaching and liturgical practice. Those of us who are part of the Christian tradition.
And another great book for people who are trying to build some bridges with their congregations that are not quite there yet is called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is an indigenous botanist. So she's fusing ancient tribal wisdom and science and finding that there are so many connections between them. And she writes so well and so poetically, beautifully. You cannot help but be moved when you read that book. And again, I think we have to, people are moved by stories. They're moved by an emotional connection to the places and the people that they love. So when in our preaching, when we can do that rhetorically, narratively, and then help create practices within our liturgy, within our activism and our advocacy, then it becomes a holistic part of our ministry as part of the church. So that's not just like one more thing that we're trying to add on here. This is just who we are.
That's really helpful, and you all are moving to our next question, which really is thinking about people who are kind of like all in on this, right? And we'll talk a little bit about those who may be on the fence or not all in, or maybe opposed to being anyway in. But when we think about ecological destruction, that the size and the scale of the crisis and any possible remedies oftentimes seem so big that those who are well intentioned, those who are eager to make changes, they're arrested by their despair, or what a lot of people now are calling eco anxiety or eco grief. My question is, how can preaching help people move beyond this sense of helplessness or grief or despair or pervasive anxiety? Because it's something we're seeing more and more and more now in the people who are around us. Xavier, could you start us off on that?
First of all, and I'm trying to think of her name. There was a Hebrew Bible professor at Wesley Theological Seminary who wrote a great book on the Psalms. I'm sure it will come to me. But she spends a lot of time talking about lament. And one of the things she names is that even lament comes from a place of hopefulness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? It comes from a place of saying that, I see the way things are, and it doesn't have to be this way. And so I would first of all encourage us to start there. It's okay and it is appropriate to lament, but let's make sure that as Christians we are lamenting and pulling on our tradition of lament that is deeply rooted in a Jewish lament that comes from a place of hope, that names things are this way, and I lament because I know they don't have to be this way, and they can be better.
Yeah.
And so I would start preaching, and you can start with the lament. But the good news is you can get to the hope, right? You can get to the hope that, hey, things can be better, and this is how we work to make them better. I think that names and affirms the sense of lament, but doesn't leave me wallowing in the lament. I think that is a very important way, because you want to name and identify people's sense of helplessness and grief and anxiety, because it's a real thing.
Yeah.
I'm an '80s kid. I grew up watching Captain Planet. We've been talking about this for at least 40 years, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. So you got to name that, but know that we're not the first to see issues like this and to lament them and to feel this helplessness, to feel this grief, to feel this anxiety. So name it, and then move us to the hope that we find in the scriptures. So what does it mean to preach a sermon series where you begin with lament, but then close out with, like, the passage in the Revelation where we see the new heaven and the new earth coming, or close out with the passage in the Psalms that reminds us that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. To build that arc in one's preaching, I think is a way to address that.
It's really helpful. I struggle so much with thinking about preaching that laments well. And I just name that. I don't have a solution to it. I just name it, because I think we're so often drawn toward the hope that we don't lament well in our preaching. And so I want to hold that for now. Leah?
Yes, there is a fine line between lament and being overwhelmed with despair. And so when people are starting to feel despair and like it doesn't matter what we do because we're going to hell in a handbasket, the question that I like to ask is, who is profiting from our despair? When we despair, that means that we won't do anything, and that the powers that are making a lot of money from the way things are allowed to go unchecked and just continue with business as usual because they profit from our despair. And I refuse to be profited from in that way. So there's actually a capitalism of despair. And as much as I love good sci-fi, a lot of that is trafficking in the gloom and doom and, apocalyptic, destructive visions of the earth to come, which on one hand we might say, well, this is just reflecting the way people are feeling on a really existential level. But in the movie Tomorrowland, the antagonist basically says, we tried to warn you and you just ate it up like a chocolate eclair. Like, we've turned it into entertainment. So we have to be really careful in our preaching of lament. And I absolutely agree that we need to do it, because if we just act like everything's fine, then the people who do know that things are not fine are wondering, why is the church not saying anything about this? And what's going on here? So we do need to name it, but how we frame it is really important. So I totally agree with what Xavier said, that if we cannot just wallow in it. Brueggemann said the point of lament is to name it as injustice and not just, oh, what a shame, and then move us to action. So to quote Joe Madison, the late great Joe Madison, the Black journalist, all right, go Joe, the Black Eagle on Sirius XM, when people would call into his radio show and they'd complain about what's going on, what was his response? Always, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? And once you start, even if it's just a small thing, that moves us forward instead of wallowing back here in the pit while the powers that be are just making their money and living high off the hog.
This is a really subtle, deft pastoral move that you're trying to make in a sermon. To honor people's grief, right? To acknowledge the feelings that people are feeling and to not invalidate them. And yet to say, to provoke them, as I think I would say in my work, like provoke them toward critical thought, right?
Yes.
And that's what you're doing here. Say, okay, it's good and healthy and natural for us to feel this way, and I'm with you. And yet, who is going to profit from us if we stay here? That's a really deft move for us to make in the pulpit. Xavier, I see you ready to jump in. Go for it.
And I'm gonna tell you, someone who helped me with that move. I want to shout out Luke Prowry at Duke. He has an amazing book out called Spirit Speech, Lament, and Celebration in Preaching that talks about how you make that move. And so if anybody wants to do this, I would recommend that book. And because it just came to me, the book on the Psalms is by and Lament is by Denise Hopkins at Wesley Theological Seminary. I think those two books are really good places to start for someone who wants to name this as an issue, name those feelings of helplessness, grief, and anxiety, but not leave people in that pit, but move them and spur them to action. I think those are two great resources that would really help people.
Yeah, that's great. So if you're building your eco preacher library, right? Y'all are building it through the names that we've already dropped tonight. But these two editions are Denise Dombrowski Hopkins, and the name of the book just came to me. It's called I think it's called Journeying Through the Psalms.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And Spirit Speech by Luke Powery, Powery. That's really helpful. And y'all are tying together really in a really important way the pastoral work that's here.
Yes.
Right. The work to attend to people and their deepest emotional needs, their deepest emotional longings, and to not just put those to the side just because we want to proclaim justice about the climate crisis. So I think that's a really helpful lesson for any of us, no matter where we are in our preaching career, to hear and to hear again. So I'm going to express just further appreciation for that ability to kind of hook that up and not disconnect them from one another, so that we like end up browbeating people and to just do more, do better, more action. So let's shift our perspective a little bit. So as preachers and teachers of preaching, as worship leaders, what advice do you give for those? And I imagine, because I work with our cohort of early career preachers, many of them are in congregations where people are hesitant to think or to hear about preaching that tangles with climate crisis. So what advice do you give for those whose congregations might be hesitant or resistant to talk about the importance of our planet's peril? Leah, can we start with you?
Yes, thank you. I have a new book coming out called Preaching and Social Issues, Tools and Tactics for Empowering Your Prophetic Voice, in which I recommend 3 possible approaches to really any social issues, but it definitely works with climate and environmental issues. And I have a thing where you assess what is your personal vulnerability and strengths, the vulnerability and strengths of your congregation, and the relationships, so that you can kind of get a sense of, do I want to go a gentle route, an invitational route, or a robust route to talk about these issues? So like if this is the first time you're talking about this with your congregation and you have some people that you think are going to give you some pushback, then I give you some strategies for a more gentle approach. The idea here is that we are trying to build bridges to get people to a place where they understand that this is what God is calling us to do and to be, because when all of us flourish, the planet flourishes, and this is living out the teachings of Jesus. So I think there needs to be a reorientation in terms of thinking about how we connect the Bible, theology, and ethics, so that people understand when we're talking about environmental issues, this isn't a political thing. This is a spiritual and faith thing. The good news is I've been doing surveys, questionnaires with pastors for the past 7 years on ministry preaching and social issues. And we ask them, we give them a list of topics like gun violence and abortion and climate change is one of them. And in 2017, the number of pastors who said they talked about climate and environmental issues was only 30%. When we did the survey in 2023, that number was up to 75%. So that is really good news. People are starting to understand it's no longer in the future. It's not in somebody else's backyard. It's affecting our community. There's no community that is not touched by this in some way. And so you have the opportunity. The other thing I will tell you is if your congregation isn't talking about climate issues, and here I'm going to quote Diana Butler Bass, who I just heard from today. If you don't talk about these issues, you might as well hang a sign on your church door that says, young people, don't even come in because we don't care about what you care about. Let me tell you, young people are very, very concerned because this is about their future. And if you're worried, like, why aren't the young people here? Well, it's probably because you're not talking about the things that are existential threats to them. So we must talk about this. Otherwise, we are complicit with the evil that is happening because we are saying that, it's not something that we feel comfortable with, or we don't think it's important enough to talk about. So we have to talk about this. How you do that, you can find your way, but you've got to say something and you've got to do something.
Xavier?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Leah. I tell my students who are pastors all the time that, quite frankly, in most of our congregations, things that are not important become important when we make them important by preaching about them.
There you go.
And so, as the pastor, as the person who is charged with proclamation, if you're hesitant, okay, you might not want to run in full bore, but preach an Earth Day sermon and name, hey, this is Earth Day. I'm going to do something. Sprinkle it in. When you read the scriptures, there are wonderful places where you can sprinkle in a comment here, a comment there, a thought there, and build your people up to the robust conversation. I know it's a hackneyed quote now, but I think it's appropriate here. To paraphrase Dr. King, we're not thermometers, we're thermostats as preachers.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
And so if it's an issue and needs to be raised and your people are not ready yet, build the scaffold and get them there through preaching and teaching. Anything can be addressed if you preach and teach your way through it as a pastor. But it takes time, it takes patience, it takes knowing when to push the accelerator, when to push the brake, when to preach for 3 weeks and then don't talk about it again for 3 months, when to do the 9-week series. You have to know your people well enough and their tolerance well enough to know how to build to the conversation. So that's what I would say to people who are hesitant to talk about it, whose congregations may be resistant. You're the preacher. Do you think they wanted to hear John the Baptist?
Or Jesus, for that matter.
They want to hear Jesus? But understanding that your job is to care for this flock as pastor preacher, and that it is your job to speak to these things. You have to just do it in a way that's wise and in a way that builds the scaffold so that people who want to get there can. I hope that made sense.
Yes, that's beautiful.
And I hear in both of your answers at least two things. The first is, and this is a point I try to make over and over again, there's no one way to do prophetic preaching, quote unquote.
Correct.
Prophetic preaching.
Correct.
Right. And I think too often we get in our minds that prophetic preaching looks and sounds like maybe one or two different things. That it's it's forceful, it's hand on the slapping on the pulpit. And I hear you both saying that there's more than one way to find yourself into a prophetic stance in the pulpit. The second thing I hear in that is what I tell my students all the time. Is like there are times when you need to exercise your pastoral spidey sense, right? And that's what I hear you saying, Xavier. When you talk about pushing on the gas and pushing on the brake and knowing when to press and knowing when to be quiet about some things, you've got to exercise that pastoral spidey sense that tells you now's the time or now is not the time. So I think that's really, really important. So I appreciate both of those, both of the ways that y'all are talking through that.
Can I add just one more thing?
Please.
There are ways to do this that are creative and can sneak things in when people don't realize it. So I did a series of 3 sermons where I preached as earth in one sermon, I preached as water in another sermon, and then I preached as ruach, air, the spirit, in another sermon. And I put some costuming on, and I talk about what it was like to be with God at the beginning during the creation and what I've seen, and I hook in with different biblical stories because, with the water, I tell the story of what it was like to be the water at the well where the woman was, and then Jesus calls the water Hudor Zoe, living water. But then what was it like to be the water in the well of the family who's been fracked, and now that water catches on fire, right? So I tell you, can't do this every Sunday, but people, and especially kids, love those kinds of sermons because they plug into the character, and you are rooting for the other than human character that is witnessing to the biblical story and to that character's relationship with God in a way that gets around, you need to care for the environment. It creates this sort of rhetorical relationship. And then it just like it hits him like, oh my gosh, that's what's going on here. So there are ways to do this that are beyond just the traditional standing in the pulpit, telling people what they should or should not do. Use your creativity in this.
That imagination opens up different doors for us, I think, and I really appreciate that. We got just a few minutes left. I want to sneak in one more question. So at any point along the way, and Leah, your last comment, I think, is starting to lead us this way. At any point along the way, from preparation to embodiment of the sermon to after the sermon, what practices support preaching that participates in the healing of the planet? And if I can put an even sharper point on this, both of you have talked about spirituality tonight, but we haven't dug into that. And so I'm wondering if you can answer that question, but also talk a little bit about spirituality as well and how that's an accompanying practice for our preaching. Xavier, can I start with you?
Sure. Yeah. So what does it mean to spend your time praying and walking outside?
Yes, there it is.
What does it mean to do your sermon prep when you can, when the weather is nice at the park? Or to go read by the lake? I think those kinds of things that connect us with nature help us to really connect in ways that we otherwise wouldn't. Sometimes we just spend too much time in these offices. We spend too much time behind stained glass. I'm a Howard Thurmanite, and so I love Howard Thurman. I have his picture up in my office at this moment. And one of the things I appreciated about Thurman is Thurman would spend time having church with rocks and with trees.
St. Francis.
Yeah. And I know I can speak from an African American religious tradition, and not just Christian, just across diasporic Africana religion. We have always had this sense of connection with nature that we need to get back to. We need to get back to it. Before we had baptismal fonts in churches, before we could afford to build those, we had baptism at lakes.
Yes.
Before we could build churches, we had church in hush harbors.
Right.
And so for us, there's always been an earthiness about our religion.
Mm.
And I would say, let's get back to that. And if we're honest about it, it's not just Black religion. There are other religious traditions that have an earthiness that, for whatever reason, Euro American Christianity or Western Christianity has gotten away from. We need to get back to that as a matter of spirituality. So, what does it mean to have Bible study in the park? Or to do your own personal devotions outside on your back porch if you have one, or go sit by the river and read and just read a book. It will connect you in ways, and I think open you to hear from the Spirit in ways, and ignite your homiletical imagination in ways that sitting in your study won't.
That's good. Thank you, Leah.
That is beautiful. And one of the great original sources of this question of like, how did we get here? How did we go from really an agrarian religion in Judaism and Christianity to a place where um, nature is seen as evil, and we're just completely, especially in white Eurocentric churches, like we're just devoid of any connection to nature. And there's a great article that Lynn White Jr. wrote called "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," and it was sort of a watershed moment for people to think about what happened to in terms of our agrarian practices, and in terms of our domination of earth, that separated us. um, Looking at the indigenous traditions of Europe and making them to seem like they're heathens. Even things like the Christmas tree, that was an indigenous tradition that was co-opted into Christianity, and we're bringing trees into our houses, people. I mean, we don't even think about like what a nature practice that is.
Mm.
But we have vestiges of it. I mean, that's a tree worshiping thing, my friends. Like, they were like, the Druids are thinking that the spirits are in the trees. We don't do it for that reason now, but do you see how the vestiges are there? There is this longing to belong to God's creation. And so when we can do the things that help us to reconnect, rebuild, reconstitute that relationship, instead of seeing ourselves as separate from, which is it's a lie. It's a complete lie. Whatever happens along with the rest of the web, it's going to happen to all of us at some point. No matter how much privilege you have and how much wealth, you cannot outrun the physics of what's happening right now. And so it is better for us to do the work now, to turn our resources towards healing the earth, the tikkun olam in the Jewish tradition. And so how do we do that? Yes, through those practices where we go out and hug a tree. When is the last time you've hugged a tree? If you have not hugged a tree in a while, I highly recommend it, because it is literally a grounding experience. It actually feels good, and you can make fun of it and they can say, "Oh, you're a tree hugger." I am a proud tree hugger. When I go out and I'm doing my walk or I'm doing a hike, I am hugging a tree. God made that tree, and I appreciate that it is putting oxygen into the air for my lungs, and I'm giving carbon dioxide back to it. And there is this exchange, this beautiful exchange that God created for us. That is a beautiful thing. So helping our young people, our adults, our kids to reconnect to that. I do that in my own spiritual practice. And then afterwards, to help give people an opportunity to engage in dialogue about what they heard in your sermon. Because let me tell you, there are deep emotional responses when they're thinking about the things that have been done, that are being done, and that lay ahead in the future. You need to give people a place to land with this so that they can process their eco grief, so that they can have some idea of, okay, how do we respond, put our faith into action, and live into the what I call the eco resurrection that God is enacting, even if we cannot see it yet.
Eco-resurrection sounds like a perfect place for us to put a pin in our conversation. So this has been incredibly rich. I know that I have benefited greatly from your partnership in this conversation. So thank you, Leah. Thank you, Xavier. I appreciate your time, your expertise, your wisdom, and your deep pastoral sensibilities. So thanks for all that you brought to the table tonight.
Thank you, Rich, for inviting us. Xavier, I love doing this with you, man. More to
Thank you.
come, right?
Yeah, we've been having fun all summer. So
Right?
It feels like, yeah, it feels like this conversation needs a part two. But friends, we would reference you to our website, www.upsem.edu/bridge. If you want to know more about the Bridge for Early Career Preachers, you can find out about our cohort program. You can sign up for our email list or make a donation to further our work. You can find us on social media, Instagram and Facebook. We also host a monthly podcast called the Preacher Cast. So check that out on wherever you get your podcasts. And as of this past month, we are now on YouTube as well. And finally, I should say that the Bridge for Early Career Preachers is funded by a generous grant from the Lilly Endowment's Compelling Preaching Initiative. You can find out about that initiative and other grant programs like ours and like Leah's that she mentioned earlier tonight through compellingpreaching.org. Thanks, everybody, for your time tonight. We are so glad that you spent this hour with us. Best wishes to you as you make your way back toward the pulpit. Take care.